The final saga of the One Piece story has been set in motion and will lead to the final war, which Oda has stated will make even Marineford look cute. Now that the world government appears to be the final antagonist of the series, it leaves the Marines in a precarious situation, which I believe can lead to a Marine civil war between Akainu and Fujitora. So in this video, we're going to discuss how a second Marineford arc at New Marineford could play out, which I believe could lead to Smoker playing a huge role in turning the tide of this war, Garp making a final sacrifice, and Luffy having to grow in a specific way before he's finally able to get his revenge against Akainu. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, be sure to watch this until the very end, where we will discuss how this could lead into the final battle against Imu and the Gorosei. This is my third prediction video of how the final saga will play out. In my first video, I discussed how I believe the Cross Guild and the Red Hair Pirates will come to Elbaf and challenge the Straw Hats in a Davy Bag fight, which is where Luffy and Shanks will reunite and where Zoro and Mihawk will have their fated duel. In the following video, I discuss how Blackbeard will kill Shanks after Elbaf, leading to Blackbeard and Luffy fighting on Laugh Tale for the One Piece and the Pirate King title. Then with the information about the Void Sentry on Laugh Tale and with the One Piece treasure in tow, Luffy and the Straw Hats will be able to take on the world government in the final war. But after they reunite with Labuna on Reverse Mountain, there are two routes that the Straw Hats can take to Marineford. Route 1 is that the Straw Hats could head down Reverse Mountain and travel through the Grand Line once again, gathering their old allies from Alabasta to Water 7. The problem is that they will end up at Old Marineford, which was rebuilt into the G1 Marine base after Whitebeard destroyed it in the Summit War. Momonga is currently the commander of this base, and he wouldn't even be a warm-up for the Straw Hats currently, so I think that the Straw Hat allies on the Paradise side of the Grand Line could probably raid this base and handle it themselves. It makes much more sense to me that the Straw Hats turn around and actually travel backwards through the New World, gathering their stronger allies like the Scabbards in Wano and the Grand Fleet, and then arrive in New Marineford with Luffy's full military force, mirroring Whitebeard's arrival to the Old Marineford during the Summit War. A New Marineford arc doesn't seem to be on many people's radar, with the only theories I see of it being that Sabo gets put up for execution, which would be really redundant as it's way too similar to the Old Marineford arc. While I'd hate for the story to retread old ground, I still think it's important for Luffy to correct his biggest failure from 2 years ago. One Piece is a 2-act story, with pre-timeskip being the first half, ending with the Summit War, which then itself ended with the powerful midpoint twist of Ace's death during the Marineford arc. And post-timeskip is the second half, which is now concluding with the Final Saga, which will end with the Final War arc. We've already seen how Egghead paralleled and concluded the storylines that were set up in the Sabaody arc, with Kizaru, Sentomaru, and Kuma taking center stage again. The Straw Hats' first big loss as a Supernova crew in Sabaody was reversed and contrasted with their first big win as a Yonko crew in Egghead. But just as the first arc of each saga mirrored each other, the final arc of each saga will mirror each other as well. Luffy's crushing loss after fighting alone during Marineford will be reversed and contrasted by him triumphing over the Marines this time, by relying on the strength of his own crew and allies during this new Marineford arc. Throughout this grand journey, Luffy has accumulated countless allies that can assist him in his final war. For example, the Straw Hat Grand Fleet have declared themselves Luffy's direct subordinates and are destined to join him during a quote-unquote incident of great proportions. So they will definitely pull up, just like Whitebeard's fleet did, although Oda may have to off-screen their fights in a similar way, just for the sake of pacing. Next is the allied nations and territories that Luffy protects, like Alabasta, Fisherman Island, Dressrosa, and Wano. The average warrior of these nations aren't that strong, but they will be able to give Luffy the pure numbers to match the scores of fighters that the Marines have. There are notable exceptions like Dory and Bragi, or Momonosuke and the Scabbards, who will have to be dealt with by the stronger Vice Admirals and CP0 members. Not everyone that Luffy has met will show up though, as Rayleigh didn't even show up for his captain's son in Marineford, so he might just trust that he's trained his student to be able to handle this war by himself. Boa Hancock and the Kuja tribe on the other hand are practically guaranteed to have Luffy's back. Even when she was working for the world government during Marineford, Boa was destroying the Pacifista left and right for Luffy. Boa might actually have to fight a stronger version of the Pacifista in her clone, S-Snake, and by this time, perhaps the Seraphim will be fully matured as Vegapunk has predicted, making them formidable opponents for whatever wildcards decide to show up, like the former warlords or any of the extra supernovas. Because this battle is to show the strength of Luffy and his full forces as the Pirate King, I don't think any of the Yonko that have already been surpassed will show up. I'm already certain that Shanks and Mihawk will go down in Elbaf, with the former dying at the hand of Blackbeard, but I think Buggy might be there, because I don't think Buggy could stop filling up even if he tried, and he might even stumble onto the empty throne at some point. During this battle, Oda will either have to give every character on Kid and Law's level or above Gorosei or Admiral matchups, or remove them from the story as a whole, so that they don't overshadow Luffy's crew and allies. So I don't think that Kaido and Big Mom will return, although I think it's possible that Katakuri, as the first commander, may lead the Big Mom pirate remnants into battle, and perhaps Marco, Ben Beckman, and perhaps even King will do the same with their respective crew remnants. If any of these factions do appear, the God's Knights could fill in any remaining matchups, although I suspect that they were designed specifically to fight the Revolutionary Army, which I will elaborate on at length in the next video. The last faction that could potentially assist Luffy against the Marines and the world government is surprisingly the Marines themselves. As we approach the end of the series, Oda is making it a point to distinguish the Marines from the world government. Pre-timeskip, it seemed as if the Marines were the muscle of the world government, with their existence being necessary to keep the celestial dragons in power. But now that the true power of the world government is slowly being revealed, the idea that the Marines are merely the public face of the world government is starting to fit a lot better. Now that Vegapunk has publicly revealed that the world is sinking into the sea, it seems obvious that the Marines must cut ties with the world government. But Oda has purposely written Vegapunk's message so that the culprit is still unknown to the general public after the Egghead incident. This gives time in the story for the Marines to deliberate in the background on whether they want to cut ties with the world government while the main story focuses on pirates, but they will be forced to make a choice when the Straw Hats and Revolutionaries strike and the world government begins their great cleansing, which will kick off the final war. The 15th anniversary opening of the One Piece anime gives us a glimpse of what the Straw Hats versus the Marines will look like, but one matchup that I don't believe will happen is Zou versus Fujitora. We've seen these two clash in Dressrosa and got to see a short skirmish in the Stampede film, but that may be all we get since Fujitora has grown to like Luffy by the end of Dressrosa, and by the time that the final war rolls around, I wouldn't be surprised to see Fujitora as an ally. At the end of the Dressrosa arc, Fujitora apologizes to the people of Dressrosa on the world government's behalf for allowing Doflamingo to destroy the country, and this apology enraged Akainu. There are a lot of parallels between Dressrosa and the story of One Piece as a whole, and I think Fujitora and Akainu's reaction to Doflamingo's downfall is a hint to how they and the Marines will react to the world government being exposed. I believe the Marines will split into two factions under these two figures. The Marines that deny the world government's faults will rally under Akainu, and the Marines that acknowledge the world government's faults will rally under Fujitora. I just don't think Oda would have made such a big deal about Akainu and Fujitora's argument if it didn't become relevant. Akainu even tells Fujitora not to return to a Marine base unless he brought Luffy in Law, so perhaps Fujitora will return to New Marineford with these two pirates in tow, but just not in the way that Akainu expected. Fujitora leading the good side of the Marines in a civil war makes perfect sense to me, as I expect him to be the perfect candidate for the Fleet Admiral when it's all said and done. I suspect most Marines will initially obey their orders and follow their Fleet Admiral Akainu out of fear, but if there's one character who will be able to disregard all labels and authority to cross the line first and be an example to the rest of the Marines that they can't change sides, that character would be Smoker. There are some obvious picks of which Marines will side with Akainu from the start and which will side with Fujitora, but there's one character that Oda has been holding out on so far in the Final Saga, despite there being two Marine missions that he could have potentially been involved in, and that character is Smoker. Throughout the story, Smoker has been that one Marine whose character specifically is centered around labels and titles. He's introduced as a genuinely good guy, just like Luffy, yet he has a vendetta against him simply because Luffy is a pirate and he is a Marine. In Alabasta, the world government gave Smoker the credit of defeating Crocodile, attempting to pass the credit from the title of a pirate to the title of the Marine, but Smoker angrily rejects this idea. And the most potent example of all is in Punk Hazard, where Smoker ends up fighting hand in hand with the pirate captains Luffy and Law. The ending of this arc gives us the clearest example of how the Marines view pirates, as the G5 fought and partied together with the Straw Hats, yet they still drew a line in the ground separating the just Marines from the evil pirates. Of course, Luffy didn't hesitate to cross this line, but Smoker did, because he still hadn't completely gone through his character arc at this point. But now that the truth of the world is slowly being revealed, when the final war rolls around, I believe Smoker's unique role in the story is to be the first Marine to switch sides, to cross this proverbial line and throw down his cape and badge. Smoker joining Fujitora's side makes perfect sense due to how much these two share values. Both Smoker and Fujitora wanted to see the end of the warlord system, both being present to witness it going wrong firsthand. But Smoker thinks that he wouldn't be capable of admitting fault like Fujitora, which could be Oda telling us that this is the end goal of his character arc, but he still has a long way to go. In Punk Hazard, Smoker teams up with Luffy and Law, and in Dressrosa, Fujitora entrusts Luffy and Law to defeat Doflamingo, which makes Akainu forbade him from entering a marine base unless he brings back these two pirates. Now all of these pieces can fit together beautifully if Fujitora returns back to Marine HQ with Luffy and Law, but as allies this time, and then Smoker switches sides to fight alongside Luffy and Law once again. When it comes to our remaining admirals, there are two routes where Oda can take their characters. The first is to simply have the Straw Hats fight the admirals as a warm-up before they take on the Gorosei. Luffy vs Akainu is a no-brainer, and if we finally get that high-speed, yellow-themed, kicking match of Sanji vs Kizaru that was teased in Egghead, I'll humbly convert to the Sanji agenda. If Fujitora does end up switching sides, then I can imagine Zoro vs Green Bull playing out. Green Bull isn't as hype of a fighter as Kizaru, but he does have a sword, which some people actually think is a black blade. Either way, I believe that Zoro will be the strongest swordsman by this point in the final war, so this fight will be more like a Hyozo or Pika difficulty rather than a King or Kaku difficulty fight, which I think is reserved for Zoro's bigger fights, like against Mihawk or Venus Juro. The other route that Oda can go with the current admirals is to have them all be defeated or defect by the time that the final war comes around, and have the Straw Hats save their strength for the Gorosei. Out of the 5 admirals that we've gotten so far, the two extremes in terms of ideology were the two that were drafted during the time skip, Green Bull and Fujitora. With Fujitora staunchly against the world government, and Green Bull who's arguably more extreme than Akainu, as he's a devout believer in the Celestial Dragon's rule. Looking back, it's pretty weird that Fujitora and Green Bull seem to get along in their first introduction, despite the fact that they have polar opposite values, and they even end up fighting each other later on during the Reverie, when Fujitora helps slaves escape with the revolutionaries. Although I think Fujitora vs Akainu will be the main ideological conflict in the Civil War, there are several other characters who will be a better matchup against Akainu in a fight. So I suspect that Green Bull's character was either initially created or retconned for the sole purpose of being Fujitora's foil and enemy in this final war. If you were to put every admiral on a spectrum from the most loyal to the least loyal to the world government, then Fujitora and Green Bull will represent the two extremes, and the original 3 admirals will fall somewhere in between. While Oda's putting more focus on the original 3 admirals' characters, making them much more nuanced and dynamic than the 2 new admirals that we've gotten, I don't think that means that all 3 of their character arcs will end in the same place. Kuzan's character is all about him seeking justice outside of the Marines, so it's much more likely to me that Fujitora will be the one to reform the system from the inside, and Kuzan's story will end with him still being a rogue pirate. Kizaru sits in the dead center on the spectrum. He wasn't as zealous as Akainu, and never questioned orders like Aokiji. Kizaru was merely a cog in the machine up until the Egghead incident, which forced him to make a choice between following his heart or following his orders, which shook him up more than anything in the story so far. I think it would be redundant narratively if Kizaru left the Marines and had the exact same character arc as Kuzan, but it would be perfect if Kizaru displayed his free will and disobeyed the world government in his final act, and Oda set up the perfect way for this to happen, which I will explain near the end of this video. Before the Straw Hats entered the New World, Oda made sure to inform us about 2 individuals who came into power over the 2-year time skip. The first being Blackbeard, who usurped the Whitebeard pirates and took over their territory, becoming one of the Yonko, and the second being Akainu, who defeated Kuzan to become the Fleet Admiral of the Marines, which is apparently stronger and more militant than ever. Most fans probably could not imagine an ending to this story that doesn't feature Blackbeard in an extremely important role, but I don't see the same energy for Akainu, despite the fact that he's framed alongside Blackbeard as the 2 looming threats for the second half of the story. Perhaps this is because Imu and the Gorosei are the true evil of the world government, which makes Akainu seem like an inferior villain in terms of scale and scope, but I believe this comes from a misunderstanding of how Akainu will fit into this story. There appears to be 2 routes in which Akainu's character and the Marines as a whole can go in. The first route is that the Marines take a similar path as Sword, by breaking away from the world government's orders. Akainu was fuming while listening to Vegapunk's message, but it's up to personal interpretation whether Akainu wanted Vegapunk to spill the beans and he was angry that this information was hidden from him, or that Akainu was mad that Vegapunk was revealing things that the world wasn't supposed to know. It would be completely illogical for Akainu and the Marines to support the government, knowing that they will flood the entire world and drown everyone. But Oda has written the story in a way where the world still doesn't realize that the world government is the culprit behind the sea level rises. With each of the Yonko making big moves toward the One Piece and the Cross Guild actively hunting Marines, it's in Akainu's character to put his full focus on quelling the upsurge of piracy rather than questioning his own values. So for that reason, I don't think Akainu is going to stage a coup d'etat anytime soon. But Egghead will be the inciting incident for Akainu, the Marines, and the world at large to gradually realize and recognize the evils of the world government. The second route that the Marines can take is a path similar to CP0, as they would intimately know how evil the world government is, but will carry out their will regardless. In this case, Akainu would truly deserve to be the warm-up fight for Imu, since he would just be carrying out the will of Imu, just like Green Bull or Lucci. Akainu does seem similar to Lucci in a way. Both are able and willing to kill innocent people for their idea of justice. But the big difference between the two is that Lucci's dark justice exists to give him an outlet for his bloodthirsty nature, while Akainu kills as a means to an end, that end being his ideology of thorough justice. The truth is, Akainu is actually most similar to his Fleet Admiral predecessor, Sengoku. Both Akainu and Sengoku believed in upholding justice, but neither were fond of the orders of the world government. Akainu even showed aggression and disrespect toward the Five Elders. Yet despite the fact that Kuzan had overwhelming support from the bottom up, and Akainu was so much more difficult, the Five Elders still chose to support Akainu in becoming the Fleet Admiral. So why? The answer to this is the key to understanding Akainu's character and his place in the story. Akainu has the potential to be one of the most nuanced and tragic characters in the entire series, especially if Oda's saving his flashback to be the last tragic backstory that we get before the series ends. Oda has drawn an image of Akainu as a child, and he appears to have suffered through violence and poverty growing up, and perhaps that was by the hands of pirates, which is the reason why he clings on to the idea of justice so strongly. Akainu is not devoted to the world government, he's devoted to the idea of justice. But just as Doflamingo said in his speech at Marineford, justice is defined by the victors, and the world government just happened to be the ruling power for the past 800 years before Akainu was even born. The tragedy of Akainu's character will be about a man stubbornly clinging to his deeply held beliefs while they crumble inside of his hands. So for that reason, I believe Akainu will have to grit his teeth and obey the world government reluctantly up until his death. When it comes to Akainu's potential matchups, there are plenty of options, with some being better than others. Dragon vs Akainu, for example, would be an extremely interesting matchup if these two ever got up from their desk. And I, like many others, believe that Akainu could have been close to Dragon when they were both in the Marines, since Akainu solely refers to Luffy as Dragon's son. But there are plenty of other characters who have a more personal grudge against Akainu. Many people believe that Sabo will fight Akainu to avenge Ace, perhaps by having his flames turn blue and surpass Akainu's magma in terms of heat, reversing what happened to Ace. The only way I see this happening is if Luffy has his hands full dealing with Imu for the entire final war, and decides to leave Akainu to be dealt with by Sabo. Sabo is Ace's brother too, but he didn't watch Ace die in his arms like Luffy did, so I don't think this will have the same emotional impact. For similar reasons, I don't like the idea of Sabo becoming Ace 2.0 and being put up for execution to motivate Luffy, as that would feel extremely redundant. But if there is going to be a parallel to Marineford, I think the most interesting character to be on the execution stand is Koby. There's a repeating pattern with Koby's character, where he will stand up against someone and speak his mind regardless of the consequences. I believe during the final war, Koby, as a member of SWORD, will renounce the world government and the Marines under Akainu. Akainu has killed Marines for deserting, so as the Fleet Admiral he would have the power to make an example out of Koby by putting him up for execution. And just as Luffy protected Koby for the first time against Alvida, and the same way Shanks protected Koby from Akainu in Marineford, fulfilling the rule of 3, I think Luffy will arrive to rescue Koby from execution, correcting his failure to save Ace last time. But there's another character that needs to atone from his failure to save Ace, and will be motivated to save Koby as well, and I think that's Monkey D. Garp. Back when Garp set out to Hachinosu, I started to see theories that Blackbeard will kill Garp, which kind of annoyed me. I wasn't annoyed because I'm a Garp fan and I don't want to see him die. I was annoyed because I'm a Garp fan and I don't want to see him die in that way. As we see in the Hachinosu raid, Monkey D. Garp would love to die heroically at the hands of pirates, while saving civilians in the future generation of Marines. But while that section of the story was great, what added depth to it was the fact that in the grand scheme of things, Garp was in the wrong. Kuzan leaving the Marines was the right choice, and it clearly bothers Garp that almost all of his family and pupils refuse to follow in his footsteps. I don't want Garp to die and his character to end before confronting this flaw inside of his worldview. So I think it's narratively most potent if Garp's character ends with him disobeying the Marines and going against the world government. Garp is one of the most complex characters in the series, and he's one of the best written given the modest amount of screen time that he gets. I said before that I think Smoker is best used as the first Marine character to cross the line and join Luffy's side. Likewise, I think it would be the most narratively satisfying if Garp was the last, as he will be struggling with the same dilemma he was put in Marineford, between his family and his job. But when he sees that another loved one is about to be killed by Akainu again, he decides that he won't hesitate and regret it like last time, and he will redeem himself by jumping into action to save his family. Now that's enough for Garp's character, and it would be honestly acceptable if he died there and then, redeeming himself in the process. Not only would this parallel Ace's death in Marineford, but it would perfectly set up Luffy's revenge fight against Akainu. Luffy vs Akainu has been set up to be one of the most personal fights in the entire series, even above Luffy vs Blackbeard. Luffy usually is not the type to hold grudges, but his hatred for Akainu is visible every time anyone even mentions his name. Now that Luffy has fought Kizaru and Egghead, it's very unlikely to me that Akainu will remain the only one of the original 3 admirals that never fights Luffy. Some people might object to this because of power scaling, as Luffy already went toe to toe against Kaido in his base form, and Akainu has not shown that he's on that caliber yet. But that might not matter at all, as Oda often just wanks a character to be as strong as the plot demands them. For example, Kizaru performed much better against Gear 4th Luffy than even Kaido did, but then Luffy completely ragdolled him in Gear 5th. Some explain this by saying Luffy only started to use Advanced Conqueror's Haki from the Star Gun forward, but there's no real way of knowing this for sure, given how inconsistently written and depicted that power-up is. But despite how badly I think Advanced Conqueror's Haki is written overall, I think it would be perfect writing if Akainu unlocks his power-up before he fights Luffy. We know Haki blooms in the heat of battle, so Akainu unlocking Advanced Conqueror's Haki to deal the finishing blow on Aokiji, concluding the fiercest battle that we heard of in the entire series, would make perfect sense. It's not a stretch to assume that Akainu already has the personality to unlock Conqueror's Haki, as he's known for his fiery and relentless personality, even willing to butt heads with the Gorosei, who all seem to be conquerors themselves. I would say Akainu is more of a conqueror than any other Marines, as he's far more radical than Sengoku, and arguably more headstrong than Garp. We've also recently found out that the cross-guild bounty for the Fleet Admiral is 5 billion berries, which is equivalent to the Pirate King himself, Roger, and the pseudo-Pirate King, Whitebeard. And I think Garp and Sengoku are implied to be on that same level, as Garp is said to have cornered Roger on countless occasions. Sengoku, who is the former Fleet Admiral, and Garp, who could have been Fleet Admiral if he wanted to, are both widely regarded as Yonko level. So perhaps Akainu as the new Fleet Admiral will rise up to this level as well, and attaining the power-up that took Luffy from butting heads with Ulti to butting heads with Kaido would be more than enough to do the job. Even after unlocking Advanced Conqueror's Haki, Luffy still needed to awaken his Devil Fruit to defeat Kaido. By the time of the final war, Luffy in Gear 5th will be at least equal or superior to Kaido. So how can Akainu still serve as an obstacle for Luffy to overcome? In the Summit War, Akainu was simultaneously holding back to protect Marineford while ruthlessly killing any Marine who abandoned their post. With the authority as the Fleet Admiral and the ensuing chaos of the world ending, Akainu may just snap and unleash his full power, using his awakening and killing anyone who stands in his way. Many people theorize that we've already seen a Logia awakening in Punk Hazard, which allowed Akainu and Aokiji to permanently terraform and change the weather of the island. Luffy fighting Akainu in a giant volcano would be extremely terrifying, but I still think Luffy's own awakening and Haki prowess would make him at least equal, if not stronger than this version of Akainu. But there's one idea that can make Akainu a terrifying obstacle for Luffy without power creeping him to become stronger than Kaido. And this crazy idea actually has pretty good reasoning behind it, and that's if Luffy isn't able to use Gear 5th against Akainu. Back when Egghead began, I was surprised to see Luffy using Gear 5th so casually. In most shonen manga, the author usually saves the most powerful transformation for the most climactic moments in fights. Oda's making an effort to try to have more fun in the final saga of his story, and Gear 5th allows him to draw Luffy having fun in his fights as well. But while Gear 5th's goofy and comedic nature can work well for symbolic fights like Luffy vs Emu, I don't think it will work well in a more personal fight like Luffy vs Akainu. Neither Joy Boy or Nika have a score to settle with Akainu, but Luffy does. Akainu is the man who traumatized Luffy by killing his brother, so we're going to need to see more emotions than joy from Luffy in this fight. We see glimpses of a more serious version of Gear 5th throughout Egghead, but still at its very premise, Gear 5th is about freedom and joy. So here's the idea. Perhaps Luffy will relive all of the trauma and anger that he felt after Ace's death, and he will be unable to muster the joy that will cause his drums of liberation to beat, which will stop him from transforming into Gear 5th. Or here's a crazier idea. Perhaps Blackbeard will gain his third Devil Fruit by temporarily stealing the Nika powers from Luffy with his Yami Yami no Mi, mirroring the fact that Blackbeard is the one who took away Luffy's brother in the first place. Either way, Luffy will then have to face these feelings that he felt at the lowest point in his entire life, and then he will have to free himself from his past trauma and doubts before he's able to regain Gear 5th again. After conquering his emotions and defeating Akainu as a result, Luffy will now finally be able to truly become the warrior of liberation for the world, and he will truly be the freest man on the seas. Now that we've sorted out how this conflict will be started and who will fight who, let's discuss how this arc will end. Almost every arc in One Piece has a countdown to the climax of the arc in the form of an impending cataclysm that is bearing down on the characters. You have Crocodile's bomb in Alabasta and Enel's Raigo in Skypiea. In Enies lobby it's the Buster Call that is raising the island, and in Thriller Bark it's the rising sun that threatens to disintegrate the Shadowless Straw Hats. In Dressrosa, Doflamingo attempts to destroy the country with his birdcage, and in Wano, Kaido almost drops Onigashima onto the flower capital. Oda flipped the script in Egghead by having the antagonist be the one pressed for time, with Vegapunk's message being a catastrophe for the Gorosei. But while the global broadcast of Vegapunk's message was a victory for the Straw Hats, it also revealed a catastrophic threat to the entire world, setting the stage for the series' biggest cataclysm so far, the Great Flood. The most pertinent piece of information that Vegapunk revealed in his message is that the world of One Piece is sinking into the sea. We see this firsthand with the global sea level rising 1 meter after the destruction of the Lucia Kingdom. The world government has likely undergone this process before in the Void Century to destroy important locations and cities of the ancient kingdom, which could include Enies Lobby or potentially the left eye of Jaya. Uranus is likely the ancient weapon that the world government used to raise islands and wash the world away with the ensuing flood, which is why they called this process the Great Cleansing. After the ancient kingdom was destroyed, the world government lacked a fuel source, which is why they weren't able to use Uranus for 800 years, up until Vegapunk invented the Mother Flame. But now that they have York, the world government will have enough fuel to completely wash away the world and end this 800-year war, leaving only Maryjois and the Red Line to be the only dry land remaining in the world. So is the One Piece world actually going to be destroyed by a great flood? Usually Oda doesn't allow the cataclysm of the arc to happen if it means the citizens will die, as we know how much Oda hates to kill off characters. But if he's able to prevent characters from dying, Oda is very willing to wipe the slate clean, which is usually seen as a fresh start for the society. This is seen in the two arcs that encapsulate the story of One Piece as a whole. Enel partially destroys Skypiea, and Doflamingo partially destroys Dressrosa. But after Luffy defeats the antagonist, the inhabitants are able to start fresh and rebuild a better society from scratch. This point is particularly emphasized with Luffy being prophesized to destroy Fishman Island, and by the end of the Fishman Island arc, the fishmen are practically begging him to do so, to give them a fresh start. Just as the reveal of the Nika fruit highlighted the importance of Skypiea, Vegapunk's revelation now shows us just how important the Fishman Island arc is to the story as a whole. If the world of One Piece is truly going to be flooded, how will the Straw Hats' allies and nations that they've saved in the past survive? At the start, it will be much easier for the royalty of each island, as Oda has designed each island so that the king's castle sits at the very highest point above sea level on the island. This will lead to a scramble for land that will highlight the class struggle that defines the One Piece world. The commoners will fight desperately for the safe land that the island's nobility have, and the island's nobility will fight desperately for the safe land that the world nobles have on the Red Line. The former crew of the Roger Pirates seem to be prepared for this outcome as well. We see this with Rayleigh being a great swimmer and a ship coder, and Crocus living inside of a whale. That's why the Roger Pirates and also Shanks' crew were wise enough to avoid eating a devil fruit, because they knew the future risk of losing your ability to swim in the world that was coming. But this still leaves the vast majority of the world out to dry, or rather out to drown. But there's potentially one thing that can save the entire One Piece world, and that's the Noah. The Noah in One Piece is a clear biblical reference to the story of Noah's Ark in the book of Genesis, where God commands Noah to build an ark that will save his family and 2 of every animal from an impending flood. In retrospect, it makes much more sense now that the Noah is meant to save all of humanity rather than just the fishmen, as it's almost as big as an entire island itself. And the fishmen really would need a boat to travel, given that they are an aquatic race. But perhaps the Noah will be used to save every One Piece race, the same way that 2 of every species was assembled on the ark in the biblical story. If the most hated race in One Piece, the fishmen, gathered every other race in One Piece onto one boat, this may be enough to break the cycle of racial hatred that infests the One Piece world. This would beautifully wrap up the themes of the Fishman Island arc, but also fulfill Jinbei's main goal, which is why I think he will be at the helm of this rescue mission. And potentially Chopper might have an even tougher task if he has to talk to every animal in the world and miraculously gather all of them peacefully onto the Noah as well. If the Noah is truly the answer to the Great Flood, all that's left to solve is logistical problems. There is still the issue of the Red Line cutting the One Piece world in half, but that can be discussed in the next video. When Shirahoshi first commanded the Sea Kings, they told her that their role was to pull the Noah. But how will the whole world's population even board the Noah, assuming that there's even enough room for everyone? There are thousands, if not millions of islands in the One Piece world, meaning that there are billions of people. So sailing the Noah to each island will take ages. But there are also Sea Kings in every ocean of the One Piece world, so perhaps the inhabitants of each island will have to board their own boats initially, but then Shirahoshi can send the Sea Kings to pull all these boats toward the Noah. Perhaps in the same way that the Yagura Bulls pull carriages in Water 7. Another possibility is that these islands are able to float, similar to Iceberg's plan to turn Water 7 into a floating boat. Perhaps Iceberg's name gives us a clue how this can be done, as some people theorize that an iceberg is the key to Thriller Bark's buoyancy. It also seems as if in Egghead, Oda is hinting that Vegapunk's sea clouds could become a life raft for humans as well. But either way, it seems as if the Water 7 arc has been foreshadowing this calamity all along. The Water 7 arc foreshadowed the sea level rise that Vegapunk predicted would flood the world. The sea level rise in Water 7 was because of the Aqua Laguna's tide. The Aqua Laguna also served a role in the story by setting the tone and transitioned the arc from Water 7 to Enies Lobby. We like to distinguish story arcs by location, but in reality, Water 7 and Enies Lobby can be considered one story, the same way that Wano and Onigashima are. I believe the new Marineford and Marie-Joie arc will be the same way, constituting the final arc of the series. When the Great Cleansing begins, Imu will destroy many important islands in the series, which will serve as the backdrop for the final war at New Marineford. Waves will be crashing down, threatening to engulf the entire island, just as Whitebeard almost did in Marineford, and perhaps it will take an awakened Ice Fruit to stop it this time. When Akainu and the Marines are ultimately defeated, Imu will see no more use for them, and will attempt to destroy New Marineford with Uranus. This is when I believe Kizaru will betray the world government like many people theorize, and make his final sacrifice. As the laser of Uranus is bearing down on the island, Kizaru will finally awaken his Light Fruit to block the laser beam, dying as a result. This will leave a giant hole from the laser around the area Kizaru was protecting, but also eternal sunshine from his awakening, just like Enies Lobby. With this tragic sacrifice, every Marine, even Akainu, will be completely disillusioned with the world government and will stop fighting. The transition from Water 7 to Enies Lobby showed us that Robin wasn't the true enemy, but she was being used by CP9, agents of the world government. Likewise, the transition between New Marineford to Marie-Joie will show us that the Marines were not the true villains, but they were also being used by the Gorosei, the highest authority of the world government. And with that, the waves will come crashing down and engulf everything below the red line, leaving the survivors with only one choice, heading to Marie-Joie for the final battle against the world government. This video was originally supposed to be the third and final part to a trilogy of predicting the final war, but it got so long that I decided to split it between the Marineford and the Marie-Joie section. So be sure to click this end card to watch the second part of this video, or if it hasn't come out already, be sure to subscribe so you can be notified right when it comes out.